right, well, thank you, Ed, for the introduction. And just to review again real quickly, I do teach at the Metropolitan Community College in Kansas City, Missouri. As of next month, I'll have been there for 3 years. Although a little more about me, I've been teaching what I've always referred to as industrial welding, what we're all teaching, for it'll be 18 and a half years. I came to Kansas City from a smaller town out east of Kansas City called Lexington, where I taught at a high school, what they call vocational technical school or area career center. Taught there for 15 and a half years. And prior to that, I guess I'll just cut to the chase. I'm a professional educator, probably unlike a lot of you sitting in here in the room where you did have a career in the welding industry and decided to join the ranks of us who make a difference in young people's lives. I actually did go to college to be a teacher, to be an instructor. I was raised on a farm, and that's where my dilemma came into play. And Mr. Hernandez, still back there, I see. He's left me a great segue. I thought I was going to be a science teacher. So I guess you can guess where the rest of this talk's going to go. I went to college I had the dilemma in college, do I want to be a biology teacher or do I want to be a chemistry teacher? And enjoyed the sciences, the science of agriculture as I knew it, being raised on a farm. But once I started investigating further, in spite of having some excellent science teachers in my high school back home, decided that I preferred to work with my hands, which is probably why all of you got into the world of welding in the first place. I was a farm boy, liked getting my hands dirty. Never saw any problem or issue with getting my hands dirty. They wash. Don't understand why people have an issue with that. You got a career where you get your hands dirty or things smell. Never made sense to me. But at any rate, I decided to change directions and became a career and technical education instructor as an undergraduate, my bachelor's degree in college, and headed into the direction of agriculture. And did teach vocational agriculture, the FFA that you're all familiar with. Was in that for 5 years and was enjoying it. Taught it as a science, believe it or not. And students enjoyed learning the practical side of science as opposed to, as Mr. Hernandez showed up here, the periodic table. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I have a periodic table hanging in my classroom back in Kansas City and had one in my classroom at Lexington where I taught welding. But using that information and teaching agriculture initially and then later welding as a science, it was pretty common to hear students, sitting in the back of the room that would make the comment, well, if my science teacher had explained it that way, I'd have understood it. And I knew early on I was onto something, that there's an academic side to science for those people that are going to be engineers, put rockets up into the air. And then there's a practical side of science for the rest of us, for those that aren't going to be rocket scientists, in other words. After teaching agriculture for 5 years, I'd started my family, and FFA, if anybody's ever been associated with that, does take up a tremendous amount of an individual's time. And I decided, with my first child being born and in my 5th year of teaching, that I needed to stay home a little more often than I was being allowed to with the FFA. And so I got out of teaching and entered industry, the business world, if you will. And knocked around in that for 10 years in the process, realizing that my calling was teaching and that I needed to get back into instruction. And it just so happens that the welding position for the industrial welding at the Career Center Technical School where I started in 1979, it was open. And the person that was the administrator of the school happened to be there as a counselor when I first left. And of course, was kind of a shoe-in. He knew me, knew my teaching style. The big concern, which I'm sure most of you are sitting here with it right now, was I didn't know the industry well enough. In fact, the Missouri Department of Education made that statement. And I was hired with the understanding that every opportunity I had to go to Kansas City, which is where most of our students were placed, would visit companies and would actually put together a series of cards. I believe there were 7 of them that I had questions, note cards that I put in my pocket. And when I showed up to talk to a plant manager or foreman or whoever the individual was that agreed to meet with me, if I could actually just interview them, and would write down answers to all those questions. And over a period of 2 or 3 years, and contacting a lot of the industry in the Kansas City area, including the construction unions, developed a real strong sense of what the welding industry was and what I needed to be doing in placing students in the industry. And so that set the groundwork. During about that time, the AWS came out with the SENSE program. I actually kind of inherited what was really nothing more than a agricultural shop. The instructor before me was a VOAG teacher, former VOAG teacher as well. And so there was a lot of projects that were built from pictures, from taking measurements at a dealership, things of that nature. Lexington's a rural community. And that's what I inherited. It just so happened about the time that I developed a real keen understanding of the manufacturing industry as welding is concerned. The American Welding Society did come out with a SENSE program. I immediately grasped it, and overnight, basically, it turned my program in from a blacksmith shop into a professional training facility, where I started placing students in the Kansas City area with that training, and in a very short period of time, developed a reputation for training qualified entry-level employees. And for those of you that are familiar with the SENSE program, and I'm sure most of you are in various degrees, the description of level 1 is an entry-level employee requiring considerable supervision, or a fair amount of supervision. Considerable may not be the correct word. And level 2 is an entry-level employee requiring minimal supervision. As you probably are also aware, the AWS allows us to increase the standards, to suit our own needs. And I immediately adopted the level 1 as an entry-level employee requiring minimal supervision. I wanted my students to be able to hit the ground running. Got to ask questions. It's a new environment. It's a new day, but with minimal supervision. I've had foremen in the past tell me, if I got to stand there beside them all day, then why do I need them? And so consequently, that became my goal, to train young people. It still exists as my goal, although a lot of the people I have as students now, I occasionally have one that's my age. But to place them into the industry where they are entry level, can't deny that fact, but requiring minimal supervision. Now, how I go about that is not only using the American Welding Society SENSE curriculum, but actually using it with the classroom component. And again, stealing some of Mr. Hernandez's thunder, I teach welding as a science, just like I taught agriculture as a science. If my science teacher had explained metals that way to me, I would have understood it. And we're not doing scientific equations, chemical reactions, etc. But I do address it from the standpoint, again, with the periodic table. I'm pointing to it all the time during my instruction. We talk about shielding gases. It makes more sense to them when they can see it connected in a practical sense. The amount of instruction, and some of you better hold on to your chairs, I was actually asked to do this by a company that's moved into Kansas City recently. They're still in the process of constructing their building, and they're wanting people that have a real strong science background. And ask, how much time do you spend with your students in the classroom? Again, if you ain't burning rod, you ain't learning welding, right? Well, we do have to have shop time or lab time, but we do have to have classroom time too, or at least from my perspective. So actually I had to sit down and figure it. I didn't really know. And in the end, for a certificate, we offer different certificates, light fabrication, structural fabrication, etc., as well as a 2-year associate degree. For our certificates, our students are in the classroom 42% of the time that they're earning their certificate, a rather large percentage. But it works. It's the very same thing that I'm doing at the college that I did all those years out there at Lexington. It's just, it's put together a little differently from a high school perspective. For those of you in high school, you probably get juniors and seniors, and they come back their senior year. A little differently at the community college level, but it still works. And it does allow those students to enter the industry with some knowledge as well as some hands-on skills. Honestly, I was pretty pleased to see Mr. Hernandez slideshow from the standpoint that it is more than just an art. It is a science. And of course, thirdly, it's a skill. Do have to spend time in the lab, won't deny that at all. But it does take some time in the classroom. Now, the whole overarching theme behind that and addressing some of the questions came up with Mr. Hernandez's presentation. How do you get these people interested? What's going on? How do we keep them interested? Unfortunately, in my career as a professional instructor, we've gone from the teacher having the respect to the parents and the respect to the community to where all we had to do is get up there and teach, and the parents made sure the students learned, to where it's gone the other direction. Students have so many different distractions, sometimes right there in your class, with their cell phones or their laptop computer if you're in a community college, where, okay, you're boring, so I'm just going to go to YouTube or do whatever else. We almost have to become actors to engage the students on a day in, day out basis. Case in point, years and years ago when I first started teaching at the VOTEC level, students coming in from as far as 35 miles away after lunch, they would sit down and immediately go to sleep. I would have too. Eat lunch, ride a bus for 35 miles, and then you sit. Even if it was only sitting for 20 minutes, I would have fallen asleep too. I soon learned that I was going to have to be kind of entertaining after lunch for that afternoon group. And that's when the idea struck that, well, why just do it in the afternoon? Do it in the morning as well. And it was a new me. I definitely had to kind of go outside my comfort zone, as opposed to just the Ben Stein type of instruction, to where I was actually up there entertaining. One thing I did finally catch on to, and I probably do it a little too much now, is you got to have a stopping point. Before long, you're moving so much that the students are distracted and not listening to what you're saying, but counting how many times you might do this or touch your hair or whatever the case might be. But you have to be animated. It's kind of unfortunate the way our educational system has gone, but we have so much competition during that 50 minutes or during that time period that you're lecturing or having a classroom discussion. And so consequently, it's what works for me is not necessarily going to work for everyone, but it's an idea that you might try if you feel like your students aren't being engaged. They find your instruction boring. Become animated. Make it exciting. Now, taking that to a different level, that's what I do with all my students anyway. I'm not just an instructor and novice actor, but I'm also a salesman. And when it comes to the welding industry, I sell my students the concept of welding careers. I don't train my students to just be a welder. Now, granted, that's what they most likely are going to do when they graduate from my program, although I have had a student go on to college to become a welding engineer. In fact, I believe we got a speaker from Laterno a little later this morning, and that's where he went to become a welding engineer. I've had other students go on to college and get four-year degrees, but a lot of what is in the industry doesn't require that necessarily, or at least yet. And so as I talk to my students every day, I'll keep that idea alive in their mind that I'm not going to be a welder for the next 30 years if they're younger people. I'm going to weld for a while, and then I'm going to see about becoming a CWI, and or I'll get into management, or I kind of like sales, or if I like computers, I'll go pick up a couple of courses in electronics and get into welding and repair. And the list, as you know, goes on and on and on. And I keep that idea, that concept that I sold them in the first place, I keep it alive. not necessarily on a daily basis, but on a pretty frequent basis. And so that keeps my students motivated, where they want to learn more. They want to learn the science of welding because they know they're going to need it if they're going to pass the CWI test, or they know they're going to need it if they're going to be in quality assurance, or if they decide to go on and become a welding engineer. And so it keeps them motivated to learn. And more often than not, one of the downsides of this instant access to information is at the college level, with some of the students having laptops on in front of them, they keep me in line. If I accidentally make a misstep in presenting some information, they'll get it on the internet real quick and it says right here, sometimes with American Welding Society site, that it's supposed to be this way. And of course then I'm old enough I can default to the senior moment, and that works rather well for me. You younger guys, you got a little ways to go yet for that. But it keeps them engaged, and it keeps me on my toes. And that's what makes me the best I can be.